Hi everyone, my name is Omi and this presentation will cover all the essentials about the content review phase. The last thing we did in this series was a 3-part Anki tutorial. Make sure you watch those before this video because Anki is a crucial part of the content review phase. In this talk, I'll go over how to budget your time to create an effective study schedule, what a typical study session looks like, how to best use test prep books like Kaplan, how Anki fits into content review, and the pitfalls to avoid during this important preparation phase. I also want to stress how important it is to maintain healthy habits during this phase because the sheer volume of material will seem overwhelming. The first thing you need to do is to find a schedule that works for you. If you're a part-time student or working full-time, you'll have a very different schedule than someone who can dedicate months to full-time study. For full-time study, you should be able to get through around 2 subject chapters a day. For everyone else, you'll need to do a test run to figure out a comfortable pace to cover the material. Try seeing how long it takes you to get through one chapter while making and reviewing Anki. Extrapolate that timing to figure out how long you need to cover all the material, as well as having enough time for practice problems. The practice phase lasts at least twice as long as content review. Remember, don't review each subject sequentially. Mimic the format of the exam by cycling through Gen Chem, Bio, Orgo, Biochem, Physics, and Psych Soc. That means you should be done with the first chapter of each subject before moving on to the next chapter. There are a total of 72 chapters across 6 subjects, so aim to finish 12 chapters a week with 1 day to rest and catch up. I'll keep repeating this, but just because you have the day off doesn't mean you get to skip Anki. You never skip Anki. Anki's spaced repetition algorithm gets thrown off if you skip your reviews and it becomes less effective. Assuming full-time study, at this pace, content review should last about 6 weeks. If you have an entire summer or a total study time of 4 months, you can add a time buffer of 1 to 2 weeks should you need the extra recovery days. If you're using the Kaplan 7-subject set of books, each chapter varies by length and depends on the subject. Introductory chapters of every subject except maybe Psych Soc will be short and breezy, but later chapters will be up to 5 times as long, so go into the process with that awareness. Kaplan's Orgo chapters are extremely short, so those days can be used to make up chapters should you fall behind. You may not have this luxury if you're using the Princeton Review Orgo book though. Biochem and Bio chapters are some of the longest of all the subjects, so expect a longer than usual study session. Psych Soc can also be quite grueling because you'll be working off of the 300-page document I mentioned in our first talk. I paired this with the Kaplan Psych book because I didn't think the document was well written, but doing this essentially adds an extra chapter to Psych days. I'll go into subject-specific tips later in this talk. Remember, the bulk of your Anki cards will come from this preparation phase, so budget your time accordingly to include 2 to 4 hours for Anki creation and review. Creating new cards and learning new cards are time-consuming, so don't underestimate the time commitment. Also, try not to fall behind on your daily reviews or new cards. It will slow you down immensely. Sprinkle Anki throughout your study session so you don't have to spend a whole day of just doing Anki. Let's talk more about how to use Anki during content review. Once you start using Anki consistently, whether it's for the MCAT or just your classes, you'll realize that taking notes is redundant. If you're using Anki for a class, you can type up or write up notes and then translate them to Anki so that you never have to refer to them again. When studying for the MCAT, don't bother taking notes of any kind. If something is important, then you can make an Anki card for it. You have 2 equally good options when it comes to doing Anki during content review. You can either Anki as you go or at the end of every chapter or section. Depending on your study style, you may prefer to absorb all the information in one uninterrupted run and then go back to make Anki, or you can just stop every paragraph to add new cards. You can test which way is faster for you, but I used a mix of both. Depending on the chapter and subject, you could have anywhere from 25 to 250 new cards per chapter, possibly more. If you're using an ebook version of the Kaplan books, you can easily copy and paste lines into Anki and add closes to your card. This will save a lot of time. Just make sure to include as many relevant images, explanations, and mnemonics with your cards, and do your best to follow my advice from the previous tutorials. When you start learning new cards, you'll get a feel for what's working and what's not working for you. Always look for ways to improve your cards, whether it's by adding colored text or subtle hints to get you to the answer. After a few days of making and reviewing Anki, you'll start to accumulate daily reviews into the hundreds of cards. Don't worry, it's manageable to get through all of them, but it can be extremely draining to sit down and plow through this many cards in one sitting. I would recommend starting the day with Anki reviews and try to do as much as you realistically can in one sitting. This is between 100 and 200 cards for me, but it may be different for you. After making a dent in your reviews, start your study session. After covering a section or two, go back to Anki to knock out 50 to 100 more cards. You'll be able to spread out your reviews without spending all your energy at the start of the day. Another strategy worth considering is learning new Anki as you make them. You'll soon learn that learning Anki takes a lot more time than reviewing old Anki. That's because you need to get each card right twice before it goes into your daily reviews. Another reason is that getting a card correct when learning new cards pushes it 15 to 30 minutes in the future for the next review. At that rate, you might have done a first pass of 30 to 50 new cards before getting retested. It's a little confusing, but once you start using it, you'll understand what I mean. I try to divide my new cards into 25 card chunks, whether it's by creating several subdecks when learning and then moving them back to the main deck, or by learning new cards in the middle of a study session once I've accumulated 25 cards. Once you reach the end of the 25 cards, it'll automatically wrap around to the start of the deck, regardless of how much time has passed. This should mitigate a lot of frustration when learning new cards. I'll reiterate this point, but making and reviewing Anki is time-consuming and frankly exhausting. But don't let them pile up. Firstly, you would be defeating the purpose of Anki by doing this. Secondly, you don't want to spend an entire day off to do 10 hours of Anki. You can trust me on that because I've done it and it's not pleasant. Let's talk about how the Kaplan books are structured. Every Kaplan subject book is organized in the same way. There are between 1 and 7 sections per chapter. Each chapter begins with a preview of all the sections and subsections. The ebook version lets you navigate the chapter by clicking on the headings here. A very important part of the chapter preview is the chapter profile section. This shows a pie chart of how relevant the chapter is to questions asked on the MCAT. Basically, it tells you whether this material is high or low yield. Certain chapters may be up to 30% relevant or extremely high yield, so definitely focus on that material. The second part of the chapter profile is the AAMC content category. This tells you which foundational concept the chapter falls under in the AAMC specifications. If you search for MCAT content on the AAMC website, you can find an outline that lists all the topics that are tested. These are used in a format of number and letter. A lot of the titles are rather vague and broad, but it can become useful when doing practice questions because every question is sorted by its category. You can identify topic weaknesses this way. More on that in the next talk about the practice phase. There's also a short introduction before each chapter that's usually a related anecdote that shows the importance of the chapter to medicine. Material in these intros aren't tested, but they are interesting to read. When you start a section, you might see a high yield badge in the corner. This indicates that the material is frequently tested. Not every section will have this, but every section does start with a list of learning objectives of what you should be able to do after covering the material. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to reinforce the material with Anki. As you get into the section, you'll notice that keywords are bolded. These terms are usually easily translated into Anki cards, so if at a minimum you make a card for each one, you'll do a decent job covering the material. There's definitely important information that isn't bolded though, so use your judgment. If you ever have doubts about making an Anki card, you probably should just make it. There are also helpful figures and diagrams throughout the section that you can use for the back extra field of your cards. Some of these can be used directly for image occlusion cards. Kaplan includes a few useful asides sprinkled throughout each section. These are little text boxes on the side of the page that either relate to test taking or important concepts, other subjects, or real-world situations. The MCAT expertise tips provide information about the actual exam, like to what extent you should know a topic or how it will be presented on the exam. These are useful test-taking strategies or insights into the structure of the exam. The key concepts box will highlight extremely important concepts that you should make Anki cards from. Bridge asides will connect the material to another subject. You might find a bridge section relating biochemistry to biology. These can be useful later on in your review because it will start to train you to connect subjects to each other in the same way the MCAT expects you to be able to do. They'll also list what chapter in the other subject is relevant should you want to look at it. At the start of your review, a lot of the bridge sections will refer to much later chapters, but it still provides a helpful preview. The real-world section relates the topic to an actual scenario or a clinical situation. These are usually too specific to be directly tested, but it gives you context for what you're learning, and it might show up in an experimental passage. Don't worry, because detailed information like this is given enough context within the passage itself, and the MCAT doesn't expect you to know it. I wouldn't make Anki for most of the real-world asides. Even Kaplan acknowledges the utility of mnemonics, and includes them every now and then for groups of items you need to memorize or even formulas. These mnemonics are usually well done and are worth adding to your own Anki. Usually once a chapter, there's a guided example with expert thinking. This section is supposed to mimic the presentation of an experimental passage. It'll set up a passage and include data like the real exam. It ends with an open-ended question and a long explanation of how to think through the passage. Just read through these sections for the exposure to passage-based information. It's not extremely helpful, so don't take too much time trying to understand these examples. That's what the practice phase is for. At the end of every section, there's a short concept check. These open-ended questions ask about important definitions or concept comparisons. They might also use tables to ask you to differentiate between certain concepts. In general, it's difficult to answer these questions from memory even though you just read the section. I would try not to spend too much time doing these. At a certain point, I stopped typing up answers and just mentally made sure I knew what they were talking about. Again, don't treat these as practice questions. They're just there to jumpstart your memory consolidation. Just like the introduction at the start of every chapter, there's also a conclusion at the end that explains what you just learned in the chapter. There's not really anything useful here, it's just a little wrap-up. After the conclusion, there's a concept summary, which is possibly the most useful part of the Kaplan books. This section lists all the bolded words with definitions or explanations. Sometimes the definition is slightly different from how it was presented in the chapter, so I would always refer to the concept summary to check if it's worded in a clearer way before making your Anki. A strange thing you might notice is that there's information in the concept summary that isn't in the chapter, so always make sure to read and make Anki from the concept summary. Next is concept check answers. You might want to use these as you go through the concept check or before moving on to a new section. Like the concept summary, there may be some extra information here that you could make Anki from. Just make sure to give it a read after attempting the concept check. Another important section is the equations to remember page, which lists all the equations mentioned in the chapter. I would highly recommend making an Anki card. Image occlusion might be the easiest for each equation. Some are derivations of other equations, but it's easier to memorize them outright with Anki than deriving it on test day. Make sure to understand what each variable represents and common units for each term. Add that information to the back extra field of the card. The discrete practice questions will be your first taste of practice. All these questions are discrete, meaning that they don't relate to a passage. Remember, the majority of questions on the exam will come with a passage. These discrete questions often test your basic knowledge. Start thinking about test-taking strategies like choice falsification or highlighting strategy here. We'll come back to those techniques during the practice phase. There's usually 15 questions for each chapter, and you can do them untimed. I would answer all of them before referring to the answers. Again, don't spend too much time here because these questions aren't exactly representative of the AAMC style. The answers follow the questions and include explanations. Sometimes these explanations will include applications of knowledge not found in the section, so make sure to create more Anki for concepts you're having trouble with. One last note that might be a little frustrating to find out is that the Kaplan books aren't perfect. In fact, they can sometimes be wrong. That's what errata are. They're errors in the text. Sometimes a discrete practice question might have the wrong answer, or maybe there's an inconsistency or typo in a chapter. You can find all of these by Googling your edition of the books with the word errata. You should be able to find a website where Kaplan lists all of the errors. This shouldn't be a huge issue, just be aware that it's a thing. All these inconsistencies will be ironed out during the practice phase. Now that we've covered how to use the Kaplan books, there's one resource that's slightly different, and that's the 300-page document for Psych Soc. The document is quite extensive, but it's not as bad as you might think. It's divided into large topics that generally last around 5 to 30 pages. There are a lot of examples, pictures, and visual mnemonics that should be incorporated into your Anki. The Kaplan books have 12 chapters a book, so we'll be splitting the document into 12 chunks about 25 to 35 pages in length. I'm not the biggest fan of the document because I find it to be poorly written, but even so, there isn't any resource out there that covers as much as this document does. There are bolded terms here too, but some of the definitions aren't really clear, so look these up in another resource like the Kaplan Psych book, or just Google the term to get a proper definition for your Anki cards. Remember, a lot of this information is based on Khan Academy YouTube videos, so it's probably why it feels like informal notes. Like I said earlier, the days you cover Psych will end up being some of the longer study sessions you'll have, but stay focused and just keep making your Anki. Psych is a very important subject on the MCAT because it's often where you can make up points lost on other sections. But the catch is that it's a section that is almost entirely dependent on memorization of terms. There will be passage-based and discrete questions where every answer choice is a term. If you don't know what it means, you can't definitively answer the question. Psych is also a section that has the highest percentile scores, meaning that most test takers score well on the section. It also means that getting a few questions wrong will drop your score faster than other sections. In another section, you might be able to get between 2 and 5 questions wrong and still get the max score of 132. In Psych, getting 1 or 2 wrong will lose you a point. Let Anki and UWorld do the heavy lifting for this subject, so you have your bases covered come exam day. I wanted to wrap up this talk by leaving you with a few ways to think about content review. Like I said in the first talk, the content review phase can trip up a lot of students' preparations. They mistakenly think it's the most important part, when in reality, it's the practice phase that's most essential. That's the content review trap. You start to eat into your practice phase because you slow down during content review. Don't sacrifice practice for content review because practice will allow you to brush up on content while improving your skills in applying the knowledge. Content review is useful for building up a solid foundation of scientific knowledge so that you don't go into practice completely blind. There are some out there that recommend skipping content review altogether and just focusing on practice questions. I don't agree with this because I believe practice questions are too valuable. You don't want to waste high quality questions, especially if they're based on introductory material that you would know if you did a short review. Sure, you'll have blind spots that will be filled in by UWorld, but with a well-run content review phase, you'll have enough to answer 70 to 90% of the practice questions. It's also frustrating to get a ton of questions wrong. It will happen, and you should take it in stride, but knowing a little goes a long way. The practice phase should feel like you're filling in gaps, not building an entire foundation. The quality of both the content review and practice phases are judged by how many high-quality Anki cards you can extract from them. I don't mean just making as many cards as you can, but doing so strategically and with purpose, which brings me to my next point. It's okay not to understand everything during content review. There are some topics that won't make sense unless you read about it multiple times or get context from a different chapter. There are even some that won't be clear until you learn how to apply the information during practice, and that's okay. A lot of my Kaplan cards were overwritten or supplemented by UWorld information because it's just explained in a clearer way. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to be perfect, because all you'll end up doing is getting burnt out and missing the point of content review. Sometimes you just need to trust that your brain will put the pieces together as you reinforce it through Anki and practice. Speaking of stress, make sure to take regular breaks. Especially if you're doing full-time study, you might find yourself studying between 6 and 12 hours a day. That's a lot, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. Find a routine that's manageable and take breaks when you need to. You can even take a full day off to regroup, but make sure to stay on top of your Anki. This whole process builds up endurance and focus that you'll need to tackle the practice phase and practice full-length exams. But remember, you get breaks on the actual exam. For me, doing Anki was a lot less stressful than making them and finishing a chapter, so I would sort of relax that way. You can also listen to instrumental music while studying or meditate between study sessions. Try experimenting with techniques like Pomodoro, where you study for a set amount of time and then relax in regular intervals. Reduce distractions around you and especially refrain from checking your phone unless you're on your break. It's hard, but it will definitely benefit you in the long run. That's all for the content phase. Next time, I'll cover the all-important practice phase. Thanks for watching.